He opened it carefully, like you'd handle something that belonged to someone who wasn't coming back. The leather was dark, worn smooth in places where hands had gripped it over years. Inside the front cover, someone had written a name in faded ink. But when Johnny Cash turned to the book of Matthew, he stopped. One page was gone. Not torn out violently. Cut. Cleanly. Deliberately. As if someone needed those exact words more than they needed the rest. If you're someone who believes stories like this matter, who thinks small mysteries say more than big headlines, consider subscribing. Because what happened in Tulsa in 1966 wasn't just about a missing page. It was about what people carry with them when everything else is gone. The Bible came to him backstage. That detail matters. Not at a church. Not handed to him by a preacher or a fan at the stage door. Backstage. The Tulsa Assembly Center was loud that night, packed with people who wanted to hear the man in black sing about trains and prisons and heartbreak. June Carter was there. The Tennessee Three were tuning up. And someone walked into that cramped, cinderblock room with a Bible that had been read so many times the spine barely held. Johnny didn't remember the man's face clearly later. That's what he told a reporter in 1971, years after the fact, almost as an aside. He remembered the hands. Rough hands. Working hands. The kind that had seen decades of labor. The man didn't say much. Just that he thought Johnny should have it. That it had belonged to someone who loved his music. That the person was gone now. Cash took it. He wasn't always comfortable with gifts like that. People gave him Bibles often. They gave him crosses, rosaries, handwritten prayers. He appreciated the gesture, but it could feel heavy. This one felt different, though. Maybe it was the way the man stood there, not asking for anything. Not wanting a photograph or an autograph. Just wanting the Bible to go somewhere it mattered. It wasn't until later, maybe on the bus between Tulsa and the next city, that Johnny opened it and noticed. Page missing. Right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5. Verses that talked about mourning. About hunger. About being persecuted. About what it meant to be poor in spirit. Someone had removed them. Carefully. He asked June about it. She looked at the cut edge, touched it lightly with one finger. Maybe they needed it more than the book did, she said. That was June. She had a way of seeing things that didn't require an explanation. Johnny kept turning it over in his mind, though. Who cuts a page out of a Bible? Not someone angry. Angry people rip. This was something else. There was a name inside the cover. Raymond Cobb, 1934. 32 years before that night in Tulsa. 32 years of something. Of what, though? The handwriting was careful. Neat. The kind of penmanship they taught in schoolhouses back when teachers still rapped knuckles with rulers if you didn't form your letters right. Raymond Cobb. Who was he? And why did someone who knew him think Johnny Cash needed to hold what he'd held? You start asking questions like that, and suddenly a Bible isn't just a Bible anymore. It's a door. Cash didn't do anything with it right away. He kept it. Put it in his bag with the other things he carried. A notebook. A harmonica he rarely played anymore. Photographs of his kids. For a while, it just traveled with him. Little Rock. Memphis. Nashville. Folsom Prison, where he played for inmates who understood something about being broken. He didn't talk about it much. But people close to him said he'd take it out sometimes, late at night in hotel rooms, and stare at that missing page like it was a message he couldn't quite decode. This is where it gets strange. Or maybe just human. A year later, maybe less, Johnny got a letter. Postmarked Tulsa. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Not the missing Bible page. A photocopy of it. Someone had copied the page before it was cut out. Why? The letter didn't say. Just a short note. He carried this in his wallet for 30 years. When he died, we put it back. Thought you should know. No signature. Raymond Cobb had cut that page out in 1934 and kept it with him. Through the Depression. through whatever his life was. 30 years. And then, at some point near the end, someone had returned it to the Bible, placed it back where it belonged, and given the whole thing away. To Johnny Cash. People don't do that by accident. They don't carry a Bible page in their wallet for 3 decades unless those words mean something that can't be explained in normal language. And they don't give that Bible to a country singer unless they believe that singer knows what it's like to need words you can't find anywhere else. Johnny never found out who sent the letter. He tried. He asked people in Tulsa if they knew a Raymond Cobb. A few did. Old-timers. They remembered a man who worked on the railroads. Quiet. Kept to himself. Lost his wife young. Raised 2 daughters on his own. Went to church every Sunday but never made a fuss about it. Died in 1965. That was about all anyone could say. Just another man who lived and died in Oklahoma and left behind a Bible with 1 page missing. But that page. Why those verses? Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. What was it about those particular lines that Raymond Cobb needed to keep close? Was it mourning? Was it meekness? Was it the promise that the broken would be okay? There's no way to know now. That's the hardest part of stories like this. The people who could explain are gone. All you have left are objects and guesses. A Bible. A missing page. A photocopy and an unsigned letter. And Johnny Cash, standing in the middle of it, trying to figure out what he was supposed to do with any of it. He talked about it once on a radio show in 1973. The host asked him about faith, about what kept him going through the hard years. The drugs? The divorce? The guilt? Johnny mentioned the Bible. He said it reminded him that faith wasn't clean. That people held onto pieces of it, not the whole thing. That sometimes you needed just 1 page, 1 verse, 1 promise, and that was enough. He didn't say much more than that. But you could hear something in his voice. Something that understood. Here's what's strange about memory. We think we remember the big moments. The concerts. The hits. The comebacks. But the things that stay with us are smaller. A Bible with a missing page. A man's name written in careful script. The feeling that someone, somewhere, believed you might understand what they couldn't say out loud. That's what Raymond Cobb gave Johnny Cash. Not a relic. A question. Did Johnny ever figure it out? Probably not. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just to carry it. To know that someone else had carried it before him. To understand that words could matter so much you'd cut them out, and keep them in your pocket until the paper wore thin and the ink started to fade. The Bible stayed with him for years. It wasn't on display. It wasn't in a museum. It was in his house. In his study. On a shelf with other books he actually read. June said he'd pick it up sometimes when he was writing songs. Not to read it, exactly. Just to hold it. As if the weight of it meant something. There's a photograph from 1978. Johnny sitting in a chair, guitar across his lap, looking out a window. On the table next to him, barely visible, is a dark leather Bible. You can't see the missing page, obviously. But people who knew the story recognized it. That's the Cobb Bible, they'd say. Still with him. Why does this matter? Why does any of this matter? Because in 1966, in a backstage room in Tulsa, a man who'd lost someone gave a Bible to a man who'd almost lost himself. And neither of them knew what it meant, not really. But it meant something. It had to. You don't carry a Bible page in your wallet for 30 years if it doesn't. There's no moral here. No lesson. Just the fact that Raymond Cobb existed. That he loved someone, or mourned someone, or needed certain words close to him for reasons nobody else could understand. And that years after he died, a stranger in black stood on a stage and sang about darkness and redemption, carrying a book that had once belonged to a man who knew what it was like to need grace and not know where to find it. Johnny Cash died in 2003. By then, the Bible had been passed to someone else. Maybe one of his children. Maybe June, before she died. Maybe it's still in the family. Or maybe it's in a box somewhere, forgotten again, waiting for someone else to notice the missing page and wonder why. Do you think stories like this just happen? Or do you think someone, somewhere, knows exactly who needs to hear them? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And whether you've ever held on to something, anything, just because the person who gave it to you thought you'd understand. People ask sometimes if Johnny ever replaced the missing page. If he taped in a new one or wrote out the verses by hand. He didn't. He left it missing. Because some absences say more than any words you could fill them with. The last time anyone remembers him talking about it was in 2001. A journalist asked him about faith, about doubt, about what kept him tethered when everything else fell apart. Johnny paused for a long time. Then he said something like this. "I've got a Bible that's missing a page. Guy who owned it before me needed it more than the book did. I don't know what he went through. I don't know why those words mattered. But I know they did. And I know he's not here anymore. So I keep it. Because somebody has to remember that people hold on. Even when you can't see what they're holding on to. That's it. That's the whole story. A Bible. A missing page. A man named Raymond Cobb. And Johnny Cash, who spent the rest of his life wondering what it all meant, knowing he'd never get an answer, and being okay with that. Because maybe faith isn't about having all the words. Maybe it's about knowing someone else needed them once. And that's enough. If you think about it, we're all carrying something like that. Some absence. Some missing piece. Something we can't explain to anyone else but can't let go of either. Raymond Cobb carried Matthew chapter 5. Johnny Cash carried the memory of a man who'd carried it before him. And maybe now, for just a moment, you're carrying it too. That's how these things work. Not through answers. Through echoes. There's one more detail. Small. Easy to miss. In Johnny's handwriting, years later, someone found a note tucked inside that Bible. Just a few words. "Raymond, I hope you found what you were looking for." No date. No explanation. Just that. Who was the note for? A dead man? God? Himself? It doesn't say. And maybe it doesn't need to. Because in the end, the only thing that matters is that someone cared enough to write it. To acknowledge that a life had been lived. That words had mattered. That a man had carried something sacred until he couldn't carry it anymore. And that another man had picked it up and carried it a little farther. That's the only immortality most of us get. Not statues. Not headlines. Just someone, years later, holding something we once held and wondering who we were. And if we were okay. And if we found what we were looking for. Johnny Cash found a Bible missing a page in 1966. Raymond Cobb lost someone in 1934. Somewhere in between, there's a story nobody will ever fully know. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the best stories are the ones that don't explain themselves. The ones that just sit there, quiet, waiting for someone to care enough to ask. So here's the question. Not for Johnny. Not for Raymond. For you. What are you carrying that you can't explain? What page is missing from your book? And when you're gone, who's going to wonder why?